The Rebbe's original approach to different parts of Torah, like, for example, Pirkei Avos, or Rashi, or Rambam, is that the Rebbe finds the one principle that guides each of these works and uses that principle to explain the difficult or mysterious parts. So, for example, what is the guiding principle of the study of Pirkei Avos? It's that Pirkei Avos is not about laws, but it's about beyond the law. And everything in Pirkei Avos has to be understood in that light. What is the guiding principle to Rashi? The guiding principle is that Rashi wants literal meaning of the verses. He's not interested in pilpul or things of that sort. And what is the guiding principle for the study of Rambam? That Rambam is halacha. That's all it is. So in those areas where Rambam seems to be philosophizing or explaining a mitzvah, the Rebbe needs to find where the halacha is, because Rambam doesn't digress. He says it's about halacha, so it's about halacha. And with this principle, the Rebbe explains many things in Rambam that remained either puzzling or simply ignored. There are many times where the Rebbe draws a parallel to show how, for example, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch begins in the same way that Rambam begins. That Torah is consistent. Here's an interesting question. If all of Torah is consistent, then where do we find a similarity between the beginning of Rambam, which he calls Mishnah Torah? Where is there a similarity between the beginning of Rambam and the beginning of Torah? The Rambam begins with Yesod HaYesodes VaAmud HaChachmas, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom. And he speaks about the knowledge that there is a God and so on. How does that fit with the beginning of Chumash? So here's an interesting parallel. The beginning of Chumash basically tells you that God, first it describes creation. But when it gets into the actual narrative, it tells the story that Adam was given a commandment not to eat from a tree, but he ate from it. And the explanation there is that Adam was told that he is placed in the garden to guard it and to work it, to keep it and to work it. When he was told not to eat from that tree, he had to ask himself, is that part of guarding it? Is that part of keeping it? What am I doing here? Just don't do it? Just don't eat? What's that? According to the Gemara, this prohibition against eating from that particular tree was temporary, because once Shabbos began, he would be allowed to eat from it. And yet, Adam decided that he was going to eat from it before Shabbos. What could possibly be the explanation here? So, a possible explanation would be that the idea that the tree would become kosher as a result of Shabbos was not acceptable to Adam. Because if the tree becomes acceptable as a result of Shabbos, then the tree hasn't really changed. It still is essentially unacceptable. It has been made acceptable by the holiness that Shabbos brings to the world. And what is wrong with that? What's wrong with that is this. In the mission that we have of perfecting the world, there are two parts. One is making the world what it should be. And the second is stopping the world from being what it shouldn't be. So there's the positive and the negative. Making the world what it should be, those are the positive mitzvahs. Stopping the world, preventing the world from being what it shouldn't be, or preventing the world from being what it already is, that's the negative commandments. So in order for this tree to become part of God's plan and not remain outside of God's plan, unacceptable, it's not enough that Shabbos comes along, makes everything good, and we go on from there. In order to change something, you have to do two things. Make it what it should be, but also stop it from being what it shouldn't be. So if Shabbos would come along and make the tree acceptable, then it would be what it should be. But it never stopped being what it shouldn't be. And that's not good enough. And those are the two parts of the job, to guard it and to work it. To guard it means make sure that it is what it should be. To work it means stop it from being what it is. Rambam begins in the same way, on the same theme. Here's what Rambam says. The principle of all principles and the foundation of all wisdom is to know that there is an existence, an original existence, from whose true existence all other existence derives. And then in the second halacha he says, and if it arises in your mind that he does not exist, then nothing else can exist. A number of questions on this. Firstly, what does it mean, the principle of all principles and the foundation of all wisdom? It's poetic, but what are these two things? Secondly, what does it mean that the first most important thing is the knowledge that there exists an original existence? Rambam quotes, where does this commandment come from? It comes from the words, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. First commandment of the Ten Commandments, I am God your God. So Rambam says that tells us that we have a mitzvah to know God's existence. Now, in the words themselves, I am God your God, where do you get this commandment from? In the words, I am God your God, it doesn't say anything about knowing. Where does Rambam get this commandment from those words? If you were to guess, I am God your God, yeah, so what does that mean? What are you supposed to do about that? Would you think, oh, he wants me to know him? Where do you get that from? Maybe he wants you to believe in him. Maybe he's just saying hi. Maybe he doesn't want anything in that one. It's an introduction. We see from this that Rambam bases his halacha very often on Zohar. Because the only place in Torah where it explains that I am God your God means that you should know him is in the Zohar. In fact, the Zohar says, this is the first of all principles, to know God's existence. And that's from the verse, I am God your God. So Rambam actually begins the same way. This is the foundation of all foundations. This is the beginning of all wisdom, to know God. So obviously Rambam studied the Zohar. And how could he not? Even though Rambam says that one should not make himself comfortable with Kabbalah, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't study Kabbalah. Rambam is saying don't get comfortable. He's not saying don't study. In fact, the opposite is true. Knowledge of God is basically Kabbalah. And Rambam is saying that the beginning of everything is you have to have knowledge of God. So what Rambam is saying is this. Halacha number 1. You have to know that God exists. He is the first existence, and from him all existence derives. The second commandment is that if you think that he doesn't exist, then nothing else can exist. The obvious question is, it's redundant. If you say that he exists and everything comes from his existence, then obviously if he doesn't exist, then nothing can come from his existence. Why do we need that second halacha? And the same question can be asked about the Ten Commandments. I am God your God, you shall have no other gods. Well, isn't that redundant? If I am God, your God, and that means the beginning of everything, then why do you have to also say, and you shall have no other gods? Particularly to make it a separate mitzvah. So the Gemara says that the first two commandments we heard from God himself, because they are the essence of Torah. Oh, if you want to talk about the essence of Torah, the first commandment is the essence. The second one doesn't seem to be. The first commandment, I am God, your God, yeah, that's the essence of the whole Torah. The second commandment, you shall have no other gods, that's not the essence, that's a result of the first one. So why are these two equally essential? The explanation is the same as mentioned before. Halacha means affecting the world. If you don't affect the world, you're not practicing halacha. And that's why every mitzvah involves a physical object. In fact, if you want to look at the world correctly, every mitzvah demands the existence of a physical object, and that's why it exists. So why does leather exist? Because tefillin demand leather. Why does flour exist? Because matzah demands flour. And so on through all the mitzvahs. Why do emotions exist? Because the mitzvah to love God means you have to have a heart. You got to have heart. If you don't have a heart, you can't do the mitzvah. Why does intelligence exist? Because there's a mitzvah that demands it. So every mitzvah affects some part of creation. That's called halacha. If you're talking about the philosophy of Torah, that doesn't necessarily affect anything. But then it's not halacha.
Mosquitoes? Why do mosquitoes exist?
Mosquitoes exist so that we can debate whether you're allowed to kill them on Shabbos. So, being that this is a work of halacha, the Rambam has to begin with the essentials of halacha. The essentials of halacha are that you have to affect the world. And in affecting the world, there are two parts. Making the world into what it should be, and not allowing the world to remain in its unholy condition. Positive and the negative. That's why he has to say that the first mitzvah is to know that God exists, and the second is that if you think that God doesn't exist, then nothing else can exist. But if we look at it a little deeper, Rambam says that it's a mitzvah to know God's existence, that he exists and he is the first existence. Why is that so necessary? It's because intelligent people, well-intentioned people, would assume that God does not exist. That doesn't mean they don't believe in God. They would assume that God, being God, does not exist. Because existence is a limitation on God. So you would assume, as the early idolaters did, that God would not create the world himself. God is too high for that. God is too removed from the physical. He created some kind of a spiritual power, which in turn created the world. That's idolatry. So idolatry was not for stupid people who think that they make a statue out of wood and that's God. The original idolaters simply believed that God left the world, nature, in the able, capable hands of the sun and the moon, or the what is it called? The astrological signs. The
Zodiacs.
Why? Because why would God himself get involved in creation? He's too high for that. In other words, existence is too low for God to get involved with. So it's not correct to say that God exists. The first principle of halacha is that that's not acceptable. If you want to philosophize, you want to talk philosophy or theology, well, maybe. Could even be correct. that you can't describe God as existing. But since this is a work of halacha, the first principle of halacha is that God exists. Not only does he exist, but he is the first existence. Motzui Rishon. What does that mean? Not only he exists in some removed way from the rest of existence. No, he is the first. After him comes the second, the creation. So God does exist in connection to the world so that all other existence can come from him. From this principle of halacha we know that we can make the world be what it's supposed to be the way God wants it to be. Since all creation comes from his existence, so the existence of all things can be like him. And that is the basis for all the positive mitzvahs that we do. How can leather serve a godly purpose? How can we say when you eat matzah on Pesach, you're eating godliness? How can that be? It's just a matzah. The answer is physical things can be like him. Why is that possible? Because the existence of all things come from his original existence. And so they can be like him. In the end, after Mashiach comes, the whole world will be like him. And that's why after Mashiach comes, or after Tchias HaMesim, then we will do mitzvahs correctly. Then it will be the real mitzvah. Then we'll really put on tefillin. Why? Because then the world will actually be like him, without exception. So when the world really becomes like him, then the tefillin really are godly, and the matzah really is godly. Then we will really be doing the mitzvah. And yet that's not enough. Because halacha has to change the world, not just put a nice coating over it. So to change the world, you have to make it be the way God wants it to be, but you also have to stop it from being what it shouldn't be. Then you've made a real change, a thorough change. That's why Rambam has to say that after you know that God made himself exist and made himself the first of all existence, which means not distant or disconnected. Now you go up on a higher level. Yale al hadas, if you go up, if it arises in your mind, which means you're thinking on a higher level, then he does not exist. And then the world can't exist either. What does that tell us? How is it that the world can become godly if by its very nature it is not? It's an alma de shikra, it's a dark world, it's an evil world, it's a false world. How can something like this become godly? In other words, how do you stop the world from being what it is? This is a fascinating and fantastic explanation in Rambam that only the Rebbe could come up with. What does it mean if it arises in your mind that he does not exist? That's atheism. That should not even be discussed. Rambam is not saying if you think there's no God. We're not talking about that. We're talking about somebody who's studying halacha. He wants to know what God wants. Can't be. We're talking about somebody who might think that there is no God. That's why the Rambam says, Im yala al hadas shehu einei nimtza, that he does not exist. He doesn't say if it occurs to you that God doesn't exist. He. What does he mean? The thing we just mentioned in the first halacha, that God makes himself the first existence. If you think God never made himself the first existence, that first existence, the he, that does not exist. God is way above existence, and you can't describe him as existing. Then nothing else can exist. What does that mean? In order for a physical thing to be what God wants it to be, God has to make himself available, close. He has to be in existence also. And he has to be the first of all existences. And all existence has to come from his existence. Then all things that exist can be like him. What makes it possible for an existing thing to give up being what it is? To stop being unholy? What makes that possible? What makes that possible is the fact that before God became an existence, he was beyond existence. That part of God affects the world as well. So that part of God that is above existence means that the world has no existence. That affects the world in such a way that it can give up its existence. Because it's so insignificant that it's not going to resist. It's not going to insist that its existence is real. Why? Because it's so not real that it can't fight it. So in order to have halacha, you have to know two things. Because these two things are essential to the fulfillment of a mitzvah. Fulfillment of a mitzvah means change the world. That's why the halacha, the Torah, was not given to angels. Because they can't change the world. They don't have a Yetzer Hara. In order to have a halacha, you have to be able to change the world. To change the world, you have to do two things. Make the physical thing like God, and make the physical thing give up being physical. What makes it possible for the physical thing to be like God? Because God makes himself like the physical thing. He makes himself exist, like the physical thing exists. That makes it possible for the physical thing to be like God. But on the other hand, on a higher level, God doesn't really exist. And therefore, nothing else can have a real existence. And that enables the physical thing to give up its existence. But if it wasn't true, if there was no part of God that does not exist, there was only the part of God that does exist, then the physical object that is the result of God's existence would be indestructible. It couldn't give up being what it is. It would take its existence too seriously. So what does Rambam mean? If it arises in your mind that he does not exist, what does it mean he does not exist? He never made himself exist, and only the non-existent part of God is, then nothing else would have any existence at all. Now, what does it mean that he doesn't exist? Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim that we can't say about God, we can't say anything positive. We can only say negative. We can only say what he's not. So what does it mean when we say God is a chacham? We don't mean he's a chacham. We mean he doesn't have any qualities of the opposite of wisdom. In other words, he doesn't have the limitations of ignorance. But he is a chacham. You can't say that. What does it mean God exists? Moreh Nevuchim says, existence is not essential. We say water exists. When you say water exists, you're talking about two things, not one thing. You're talking about water, and you're talking about the existence of water. Water's existence was added to the water because there was a time when it didn't exist, and then God made it exist. So the existence of water is not synonymous with the water itself. Anything that once did not exist acquires existence as an additional ingredient. This is what is meant. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. When God said, "Let there be light," what was he talking about? You know what I'm saying? If light didn't exist, then what did it mean when God said, "Let there be light"? What's light if it doesn't exist? So obviously there is light, but it doesn't exist. So God said, stop that. Start existing. And it existed. That's the case with all of creation. If something didn't exist, then making it exist is simply adding something to it. That is not it. God always existed. So when we say God exists, we don't mean God has an existence, like something added on to him. And therefore, this is why Maimonides Nevuchim gets a little tricky, and therefore, God doesn't really exist. Because the word exist implies something added on, and you can't use that word to describe God. And Rambam gives an interesting example. So, does God exist or not? Is God a chacham or not? Is God strong or not? He says, God is God. You can't use those words. It's like saying, here's this example, is mesikus sweetness? Is it straight or crooked? It's not straight, it's not crooked. The whole thing doesn't apply. There's another example he gives. Is a voice salty or sweet or sour? A voice? It's not salty. It's a voice. It's not governed by those properties. So you can't say God. So bottom line, does he or does he not exist? The answer, who are you talking about? Existence doesn't apply to him. Existence applies to something that once didn't exist. But since he always exists, you can't call him existing. In other words, since he didn't become, so you can't say he exists. That's what Rambam means. If you get up to a higher level, you will understand that he doesn't exist. He's God, and therefore you can't describe him as existing. So what about all the things that exist from him? They're nothing. And therefore they are willing to change and become him. That's what enables us to do a mitzvah. Now the Rebbe says, why does Rambam use these two expressions, Yesod HaYesodes, the foundation of all foundations, and the pillar of all wisdom? What is this poetry here? So he says like this. There are two kinds of mitzvahs. There are mitzvahs that are called foundation, and there are mitzvahs that are called wisdom. Like, Kihi chachmaschem ubinaschem le'enei kol ha'amim. The mitzvahs are our wisdom. The mitzvahs that are the foundation are those mitzvahs, or those things without which there can be no Torah. Those are the mitzvahs that the Rambam describes in the first volume, or in the first chelik, Yesodei HaTorah, or Sefer Hamada. The knowledge of God, the avoidance of idol worship, that the Torah is the word of God, that the prophets are true. Without this, there is no Torah. These are the foundations, which is different from a pillar. A thing can exist without a pillar. It just doesn't have what to rest on. So what would happen without a pillar? Without a pillar, whatever there is would be on the floor. It wouldn't be propped up to its proper height without the pillar, but it would exist. Without a foundation, nothing can exist. So those mitzvahs that are in the first part, the first chelik of Rambam, those are called Yesodes. Because without them, you can't have Torah. That's why it's interesting. I don't know if anybody else notices these things. In the section of Rambam called the foundation, the Yesodes, Rambam talks about belief in God, not believing in idols, but there are so many other fundamental principles that the Rambam does not include. Like, for example, the belief in Mashiach. It's one of the 13 principles of faith, and yet Rambam leaves it for the end. Why isn't it one of the principles, one of the Yesodei HaTorah? The answer is because you can do mitzvahs even if you don't believe in Mashiach. So halachically, the belief in Mashiach is not a fundamental principle. because all of Torah and mitzvahs does not depend on your believing in Mashiach. But it depends on your believing in God, in Torah, in the prophets, not believing in idols. So Yesod HaYesodes means the first principle of the principles of Torah. Amud HaChachmas means the foundation on which the other mitzvahs stand. All the other mitzvahs do not depend so much on the knowledge of God. You can put on tefillin even if you're not familiar with God. You can give tzedakah even if you don't believe in God at all. But it's not the right way. It's a mitzvah lying on the ground. It's not a mitzvah on its proper pedestal, on its proper height. So this is what Rambam means, that you have to have the foundation for the fundamental mitzvahs, and you have to have a pillar for the mitzvahs that are our wisdom. Now the Rebbe connects it with Hasidus. To understand it properly, we're told that Rambam begins with these words because he wants to start his work. He wants to start the Sefer with the name of God. So Yesod HaYesodes, the first letters of the word, Yesod HaYesodes is a Yud and a Hey. Va'amud HaChachmas is a Vav and a Hey. Together they make up the name of God. The Rebbe once pointed out that this is similar to the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, which begins with Yehuda ben Tema. Yehuda are the letters of God's name. The Yud and the Hey and the Vav. Why is this relevant here in the beginning of Rambam? Not just because he wants to mention God. These two things that he's going to tell you, which are the foundation and pillar of all halacha, are represented in God's name. Because in God's name there are two parts. The first two letters and the second two letters. The first two letters represent the hidden world. As the Gemara says, Olam Haba was created from the first two letters. Olam Hazeh was created from the last two letters. And that's why Hanestores Lashem Elokeinu, that's Olam Haba. Hanigles Lonu, that's Olam Hazeh. So the Yud K represents the hidden, and the Vav K represents the revealed. A foundation is usually hidden. Wisdom is not, is revealed. When a person has a conviction that he can't explain, he knows there's a God, but he's not wise in that knowledge. So he can't explain it. So that conviction remains within him. He has the conviction, he can't share it because he doesn't know how to explain it. When you do understand something, then it is available to others as well, because you can share it, you can explain it. Fascinating thing. Of all the miftzayim that the Rebbe made, there is no miftzah of belief. There is no project to go around telling people to believe. Because belief you can't explain. If you can't explain it, then it's not available to somebody else. It's hidden, like a foundation. What you can explain, this you can share with somebody else, because it's like wisdom. Wisdom is available to everybody. Again, that's why he says there are two kinds of mitzvahs, the mitzvahs that are the foundation and the mitzvahs that are the chachma. Amud HaChachmas. So the wisdom that is the foundation, that's represented by the Yud and the K and the Hey. Therefore, it describes those mitzvahs that you don't explain, that you can't explain, that they are fundamentals. And the Vav and the Hey represent those mitzvahs that you can explain. Here's another fascinating thing. Yesod HaYesodes ve'amud HaChachmas. Those are the four letters of God's name. But talk about Yesod, talk about fundamental. Listen to this. The Yud of the word Yesod is part of the word. That's the word. The word is Yesod. The Hey that follows is not part of the word. It's Yesod ha-Yesodes. So what is that called? The Hey is a prefix or a support to the word. It is not the word itself. The same is true with the Amud ha-Chochmas. The Vav and the Hey are not part of the word. The Amud, the word is Amud. Ha-Chochmas, the word is Chochmas. Only the Yud of Yesod is part of the word itself. Only the Yud of the word fundamental is fundamental. And why is that? It explains in Chassidus that the letter Yud in God's name means constant. Kocha Yaseiv. When you have a Yud that is not part of the word, but it appears at the beginning of a word, it can either mean future tense or it can mean constant. The creation of the world, which comes from the letters of God's name, are a constant. God has to be creating the world constantly. So that's why that principle is represented by the Yud that is a necessary part of the word. It's fundamental. It has to be there because creation has to be going on constantly at all times, otherwise there's nothing. The moral of the story is that the hidden parts of Torah and the revealed parts of Torah cannot exist separately. One without the other is incomplete. Just as in the halacha, you have to have the part of the mitzvah that is revealed and the part of the mitzvah that is higher, hidden. The same is true in the study of Torah. You have to study the part of Torah that is understandable, and you have to study the part of Torah that is hidden. Otherwise, you have a half a product. And the world has not achieved what it needs to be. Now the Rambam concludes. What's going to happen when Mashiach comes? The Rambam says when Mashiach comes, there will be no other pursuit in the world other than the pursuit of the knowledge of God. And then he says, because at that time, there will be no wars, there will be no competition, there will be no animosity. So again, the same questions. If there will be nothing in the world except the pursuit of God, why would there be wars? Why do you have to say there won't be wars? Goes without saying that there won't be wars. Because if the whole world is obsessed with the knowledge of God, why would there be wars? Rambam is trying to say that when we do the mitzvahs that are described in the 14 volumes of halacha, then two things will happen. The world will be the way God wants it to be. That's expressed in the fact that everybody will be pursuing the knowledge of God. And secondly, there will be no wars. The world will have changed. So it's not that there will be no wars because we'll be distracted. No. We will be devoted to the study to the knowledge of God, and the world will have changed accordingly. It will no longer be a world of wars or of animosity or of competition. It will be a different world. Then Rambam says, why won't there be any competition, any wars? Because all good things will be available in abundance. All good things, including luxuries, delicacies, will be available in abundance. What does this mean? When the world becomes what it's supposed to be, it doesn't stop existing. On the contrary, when it gives up being its unholy self and becomes more like God, then all good things will be abundantly available. It won't stop existing. It will be, but it will be godly. Why will people eat or drink or enjoy the luxuries of life because of their godly potential. Not for itself, not the old way, where the physical things were a distraction from godliness. They will exist, and they will exist as an integral part of God. That's why Rambam says, Madanim ka'ofar. It will be so abundant like sand. Meaning to say, just like sand is not interesting in and of itself, nobody has a desire for sand. Nobody will have a desire for physical things, for the delicacies, for their own sake. Only for the sake of heaven. And this is why Rambam breaks it into two things. He says, Hatayvot yihiyem mushpa'as harbe. All good will be available in abundance. And madanim ka'ofar. And delicacies will be available like earth. What is good things and delicacies? Rambam says when things are good for a person, he may not know it. So even if things are good, he may not be satisfied because he doesn't know that they're good. So saying that then everything will be good is not enough. So Rambam says, not only will everything be good, but even delicacies will be abundantly available. What are delicacies? You can't have a delicacy and not know it. A delicacy means your pleasure. If you don't know it, then you don't have pleasure. So again, Rambam is saying there will be two things. There will be the good that we may not know, but then there will also be the delicacies that everybody appreciates, that is revealed and known. Then the Rambam says, that's why at that time Jews will be great chachamim, because they will know hidden things. And they will come to know God according to the ability of the human being, to the capacity of the human being. Again, Rambam is talking about two things. We will know hidden things, and we will understand God as much as is humanly possible. So we're talking about the knowable and the unknowable. We will know hidden things because they will become knowable. And then there will be the awareness or knowledge of God that as far as we can understand, we'll understand. But basically it's a non-knowable subject. What is the bottom line of it all? Bottom line of it all is that we have to have two attitudes or two feelings, two experiences in order to fulfill our purpose in the world. One makes us take the world seriously. World is important. Physical things are important. They're significant. On the other hand, we also have to have this feeling that none of it has any meaning at all. Or as Shlomo HaMelech says, vanity of vanities, it's all vanity. So which is it? The Mishnah says 1 hour of good deeds in this world is better than an eternity in heaven. And Shlomo HaMelech says, vanity of vanities, it's all nothing. Which is it? It's got to be both. On the video, the Rebbe speaks about the two sides of education. On the one hand, you tell a child that he's good, that he should stay strong, not forget what he's taught, be loyal to what he was given, stay on the straight and narrow. On the other hand, you tell a child, you have to change. You got to keep changing. You got to keep growing. Whatever was good yesterday is not good enough today. They seem like conflicting messages. And we get very confused by this. A kid knows that he's an observant child, he's frum, well, then it's done. He doesn't need to change. He is what he's supposed to be. Why does he need to change? You tell a child he needs to change, are you suggesting that what he was taught was not good enough? He was taught all the right things. He's a mitzvah boy. Why should he change? It's not conflicting messages. It's the same thing. But there are two sides to the coin. In order to be correct, in order to be right, you have to have two things. You have to know, as the Rebbe once said, that this is a beautiful world. God created a beautiful world because it can be what God wants it to be. But on the other hand, you have to know this world is terrible. Everything about it is bad. Its very existence is negative because it exists in contradiction to God. It is real, that's unholy. That's idolatry. God is real, nothing else. On the other hand, if the world is not real, then how can we do mitzvahs? The Rebbe has this argument. There are people who believe that the world is not real. I mean, some very learned Jews believe that the world is not real. And that's why there is only God, nothing else exists. What about the world and everything we see? It's not real. The Rebbe says that can't be true. First of all, it says, Bereshis bara Elikim. If the Torah says that God created the world, then it does exist. Because Torah says that He created it. Maybe God created a figment of our imagination. So the Rebbe says, no, that can't be either. Because there's a command, there's a prohibition against practicing magic. If the whole world is a figment of our imagination, what's magic? Magic means creating an illusion. Well, the whole world is an illusion. So how can that be a sin? You're not doing anything unusual by practicing magic, because the whole world is an illusion. So it's just a little more illusion. Oh, because that much illusion you can't have. It's 0 and 0 is 0. I mean, it wouldn't make any difference. So obviously, from the Torah, the world is true. Its existence is true. And that's why the mitzvahs matter. Because you're either destroying a world that exists, that is true, or you're enhancing a world that exists and is true. And that's why it's significant that God could have created the world with one word, with one utterance, but He created it with 10. Why? To give it more substance. To make it 10 times more important. So if you do a mitzvah, you're helping a world that God created with 10 utterances, 10 times reality, 10 dimensions of reality. And if you sin, you're ruining a world that was created with 10 dimensions of reality. On the other hand, Shlomo Melech says, yeah, but it's all nothing. It's all vanity. Don't get impressed. In order for the world to be what it can be, you have to see its insignificance. You have to get past its immutable or apparently immutable nature so that you can see that it can change. When you know that it can change because its nature is not immutable, then when you do a mitzvah, you're actually producing a real change, not just a coating on a basically unacceptable thing. That's why Adam ate from the tree on Friday and didn't wait for Shabbos when it would become kosher. Because to wait for Shabbos to make it kosher is only half the project. If Shabbos comes along, it will make even this tree kosher. Because it's Shabbos. Not that you've really changed the tree. So before Shabbos can make the tree kosher, it first has to give up being what it is. And in order to make it give up being what it is, he had to deal with it, work with it, before Shabbos came. How did he deal with it? He ate from the tree and then did tshuva. That way, the tree itself has become a useful part of creation. Not because of Shabbos, because of it. Even a sin has become a useful part of creation because it produces tshuva. And again, those are the two responsibilities that they were given, to work it and to guard it. Keep what is good, good, but get rid of what is bad. So Rambam sets this down as the two essential pieces of information without which you cannot begin halacha. So none of this is philosophy. There exists an original existence from whom other existence comes. This sounds like philosophy. It sounds like something that should be in the Moreh Nevuchim. But it's not. It is essential to halacha. On the other hand, Rambam does not elaborate. This is all very briefly stated. It is the principle, not the explanation. Why? Because Rambam believes that a person should not engage in the study of Kabbalah unless he's already mastered everything else. But that's the study of Kabbalah. The knowledge of the fundamentals of Kabbalah that you have to have before you start any other study. So Rambam begins with God's existing, God not existing, very Kabbalistic concepts based on the Zohar. And he says, this is the beginning. You don't know anything yet. And we're beginning with Kabbalah. How do we know that Rambam is talking to people who don't know anything? Because Rambam says that all you need to do is learn the Chumash, then nothing else, go directly to the book that he's about to write, and you will know everything you need to know. So he's talking to people who have learned Chumash and nothing else. And then he says, this work is written kekoten kegodel, for the great and for the small. Great, obviously, in knowledge, and the small in knowledge. So if this is for the small in knowledge, this is not somebody who has already mastered all other parts of Torah. And yet the Rambam begins with Zohar, without mentioning it. And then later on, the Rambam says, you're not allowed to study the secrets of Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava. You're not allowed to do this unless you've mastered all other parts of Torah. You're not allowed to pursue the pleasures of Kabbalah unless you've mastered all other parts of Torah. But to be aware of the fundamentals of Kabbalah, this is indispensable, and this you have to know before you learn anything. It's the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom. I wonder if Rambam himself knew how much he was saying. Moshe Rabbeinu was very upset because he heard Rabbi Akiva teaching, and Rabbi Akiva was teaching things that Moshe himself never knew. So he felt terrible. So God said to him, don't feel bad. He's basing it all on what you received at Har Sinai. So what does that mean? If Moshe received it all at Har Sinai, how come Moshe didn't know? Moshe taught people more than he realized he was teaching. But he taught it. Rabbi Akiva came along later and opened up the package and revealed what was inside. But it was there because Moshe taught it. So I guess same can be true of Moshe ben Maimon. Especially according to the Arizal, Rabbi Akiva was a Gilgal of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why they both started their careers late in life. That's why they both lived to be 120. And that's why Moshe had nothing to be upset about. This is you in a further development.